that's very kind of you, and it's very kind of Alzheimer's Europe to invite me to address you. The Roadmap project is a very distributed, very complex project, and Alzheimer's Europe led one of our work packages, and it was a great pleasure to work with Jean-Georges and Christophe, and I thank them very much for all of their assistance. So I'm going to talk about some findings, but really I'm going to talk about some learnings. So in one sense, a lot has been spoken and thought and theorized about real-world evidence, and the Roadmap project really was far more the practical experience of using it. And we discovered that real-world evidence is wonderful, but it's much harder to apply than one might imagine. So the goals were to develop a natural history model across disease stages, to develop appropriate health, economic, and budget impact models, and to set new standards for the collation and evaluation of real-world evidence to inform decisions. And we had 24 months to achieve these ambitious goals. We effectively did it through some key core central work packages and some support work packages. So we looked at outcome, the definition of outcomes, the identification and mapping of data, disease modeling, and health economics. And we really did want to create a very integrated environment. We needed to create, if you like, a consensus ethos, a very collaborative ethos. And so we had regulators as well. And our regulators were fantastic. I have to say, the quality, the flexibility, and the constructiveness of our regulatory board was second to none. I was really pleased and impressed with that. We also had stakeholder engagement through Alzheimer's Europe and a comprehensive LC Eagle Ethical and Social Issues work package just to see, identify what the issues were. So I'm going to look at lessons learned from work packages 2, 3, 4, and 5. So also we had some access to some fantastic data. So we took on the data pyramid concept where we have national registries, very broad, but a bit like the Amazon River Basin, very, very broad, but about 3 inches deep. We then had patient-reported outcomes. We had cohorts which had better data and some trials data. And the idea is to see which data sets could we identify, which data sets could we access, and which data sets could we integrate. And using these data sets, we'd like to characterize the natural history of disease and harmonize data collection methods and analytical tools. We had some core technologies that we adopted. We didn't start from scratch, so we used extensively the EMIF-AD catalog and the software that comes along with that and some common data models. We used UK technology as well, coming through the UK CERP, the UK Secure Electronic Research Platform. And we had data sets coming from Utrecht, UK Biobank, and the Dementias Platform UK, and IXICO's Me Health and One devices platform. So going on to work package 2, data outcomes, it was very interesting surveying, if you like, clinicians, surveying academics, surveying policymakers, surveying people with dementia. And effectively, they come up with different priorities, but the priorities overlap significantly. And whereas you might think as a clinician, what we really want to know, the priority is definitely understanding the pathology, because we want to develop, if you like, disease-modifying therapies. To the patient, the priority is understanding the cognitive change. And I appreciate that's in the absence of a disease-modifying therapy, and these things might change as soon as one becomes available. But nevertheless, the idea of, what is my cognitive change and what is my ability to live independently came out as way, way the most important priorities. And I think that's a salutary lesson for academics and healthcare professionals alike, who get very involved in their own specialty and are very rigorous and are very precise. But actually, what the patient wants is, how is my mind and how is my lifestyle? Very, very simple. For work package 3, where we're looking at integrating data sources, we identified many, many data sources. So, and I think the EMIF-AD platform was really, really strong in identifying electronic healthcare records. We have electronic healthcare records for 65 million people across Europe. We had cohorts. We have between 40 and 100 cohorts, really bringing together roughly 2 million people across Europe. And then there were smaller studies looking at devices. So we have, in one sense, enormous access to incredible data. The question is, of what use is it in terms of real-world evidence? In terms of data discovery tools, if you look at all the catalogues, DPUK included, you may be forgiven for thinking that the data discovery tools lack some creative imagination. You are faced with dictionaries, and you're faced with sort of thousands of variables. It's very hard to get hold of. And one of the fantastic outputs from Roadmap was the development of the data cube, and I think we should thank Synapse, the CRO that project managed Roadmap, and did an absolutely excellent job, I have to say. We must thank Synapse for this, and there will be a presentation later on in the conference, and I really do advise you to go. It's really intuitive, it's dynamic, the response is rapid, and it gives you an awful lot of information, about disease stages, data sources, and different outcomes. And bringing all that together, synthesizing that, was really what Roadmap is all about. And so later on in this conference, I thoroughly recommend you go to that. In terms of disease modeling, this is really very, very interesting. Because if you think about it, data sets, we like to think of data sets as having universal application. But implicitly, every data set is designed for a purpose. And that's great, that's inevitable. But what it means is every other purpose, it has the legacy of the original purpose tied to it. And that is absolutely no way of avoiding that. So for example, cohort data sets are designed to identify etiology. And typically, in the previous 50 years or so, they have been disease agnostic or largely disease agnostic, i.e. trying to identify the causes of many, many diseases. Electronic health records are really there to help clinical decision making. But in the absence of a disease-modifying treatment, it's very hard to make an informed clinical decision. So the importance of keeping standardized health records is really not so great. And when we bring these two things together, then we discover that asking very specific, rigorous questions actually becomes very difficult. Also, an academic might look at a data set and think, well, this is really interesting, and be very creative in exploiting it and make it informative. But to a regulator, you want to know what is this, and how has it changed that? And again, that's a wonderfully legitimate question, but very few data sets are designed to answer that question. And therefore, out of your millions of electronic health records and out of your hundreds of thousands of cohort participants, finding the exact data set to answer the question actually proves very, very difficult. And we used various sets of data, and I'm going to give you one example. Or actually, I think I've lost a slide as well here. Well, how does that happen? Never mind. Going on to work package 5, we have the health-related quality of life with people with pre-dementia or dementia. Again, the thing about the health economic data is it's always, and I mean always, legacy data. And I give you a challenge. Have you ever heard a talk by a health economist who said at the beginning, these are the data we want to have? Doesn't happen. What they say is, these are the data we've been given, and this is the best job we can do with those data. And it's very creative and it's very informative, and I admire the rigor of it, but that is not the point. It is not necessarily the data that you really want in order to answer the question that you're really asking. And here we have an example. This is a systematic literature review coming out of Roadmap, and along the top you have the patient self-rated quality of health, and along the bottom, the orange, you have the carer-related quality of health of the patient, and you can see that the two just do not match. The patient thinks they're doing fine. The carer thinks it's not so good. But we do not have the tools which will allow patients to be able to sensitively gauge their quality of life. And if they cannot gauge their quality of life, it's very difficult to impose a better quality of life on them without some sense of understanding, some sense of consent. So again, it's just an example that we have plenty of data, but it may not be the data that we really want to have. So the journey so far. Well, we have established, and I think one of the remarkable things about the Roadmap project was its collegiate approach. Industry and academics and regulators coming together in what you might define very clearly as pre-competitive space, not to be competitors, but actually to share problems, to identify best practice, to create and offer solutions. And this has been remarkable. This has been a most refreshing collaboration, and I just would like to thank all of my colleagues at industry, academic, regulators for the very constructive and generous approach to the project. We know where to go. We know we need to establish a broad-based evidence base, which is based on consensus on the priority outcomes for dementia patients and developing dementia treatment pathways. So we know where we want to go. We know what we know. We know that we have developed a comprehensive database. This data cube and the data surrounding coming out of the Roadmap project is probably the most comprehensive database there is. I know it's very dangerous to say that in an audience like this, because there'll be several of you in the audience going, no, mine's just as good, if not better. And I will not argue with you, but I think I'm right. Okay. So there we are. There is that. We know what we don't know. In truth, with the millions of records, the current evidence base is inadequate. It's not really fit for purpose. It's very hard to do disease modeling. It's very hard to identify, let alone access informative data sets. And that is not going to change by just, can we collect more data? This is something which is intrinsically, if you like, it's a constitutional problem of the dementia research environment. And therefore we know what to do. We know we need to make a strong case for collecting new data, for collecting fit-for-purpose real-world evidence. And this involves an investment of time and money and thought. Now, I've only got 50 minutes, so I don't have much time. And I'm an academic, so I don't have much money. But I can give you a little bit of thought on it. Okay. We need to have a consensus on study design and a consensus on standard medical records. And really, we need a clarity on how we can develop models of the natural history of disease which can be tested. So it all boils down to this one graph. Let's just pretend for a moment that this is data from a cohort. And in this cohort, we have people being measured very thoroughly every 5 years or whatever for change. And then there's a diagnosis. And what happens after that is the follow-up becomes much more difficult to achieve. And therefore, your estimates of disease progression and your ability to test disease progression models fails. Let's presume this is an electronic health record. Again, somebody comes to the memory clinic, you discover they have a mild cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's disease, but there's no disease-modifying treatment. So again, the follow-up fails, and therefore the data do not allow you to test disease progression models. So in both situations, you have this problem. So really, the way forward is to identify the question. What is the question? Generic or disease-agnostic models are inadequate. What are the standard measures? Diverse measures perform poorly, and they're poorly understood by regulators. If there was standardization of measures, you'd have decisions made much more quickly with much greater confidence. And thirdly, how can we do this quickly? Okay, let me just, to finish briefly. We have two problems. Here is the rate of change when you are diagnosed. Here is the rate of change before you are diagnosed. Standard clinical assessments will not do for early detection. So you need different systems for each. And they can be comparable. They can, if you like, be harmonized, but nevertheless, they are distinct methods. Also, you need to work at scale. So here is an analysis of blood pressure and mortality in 5,000 people with different, according to age. It's a bit of a mess, really. If we go to 50,000 people, you can see that there is a difference according to age group, and you're not quite sure what the shape of the curve is. If you go to 500,000 people, you have a definitive result. You do not need to do this study again. That's it. Okay? So we need standard measures. We need these measures to be measured in clinical and population situations at scale. and we will then get definitive results. Finally, I'd just like to thank all the many, many contributors to this wonderful, wonderful consortium. Thank you very much.